I think this is a rather atypical talk for this conference. Diraj invited me and asked me to talk about the relationship between my work on the prosumer, which I've been doing on the concept itself for maybe the last 5 years or so, but actually been writing about it without the term for several decades. In a book on the McDonaldization of society, I wrote about how McDonald's, one of the innovations at McDonald's is putting the customer to work. And that idea, of course, is a prosumer idea. The term prosumer is the combination of the producer and the consumer. And what McDonald's was doing was taking consumers and putting them to work. So turning consumers into producers, producers into consumers. And in other things that I've written over the years, I've come back to that theme without the term. And about 5-6 years ago, I discovered the term, which was created by Alvin Toffler in his book Future Shock in 1980. But while Future Shock got a great deal of attention, the term did not get a lot of attention. And so there are very few citations to Toffler on the concept of the prosumer, even though his work on Future Shock, the third wave, was a great popular success. I don't think it was a great academic success. In any case, Diraj asked me to take that work and think about the issue of collaboration as it exists on both digital and the material, new means of prosumption, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go. So I sort of take as a takeoff point here the cyber-utopian idea that the internet, especially social networking sites, makes possible dramatic, revolutionary increases and improvements in social collaboration. And I want to look at that from this point of view, whether that's true or not. And recently, of course, there's been this action taken by Yahoo and other companies where they've shifted away from allowing work at home, presumably collaborative work over the internet and other ways, and moved them back into the workplace. And so instead of working alone or in digital collaboration, Yahoo now wants its employees to collaborate more directly in the workplace, with the belief that the quote face-to-face interaction among employees fosters a more collaborative culture, presumably than the collaboration that's possible digitally. It's driven by the idea that the more interaction, collaboration leads to more innovation, and obviously Yahoo, as poorly as it's been doing in recent years, is very much interested in being more innovative. This has led to a debate in the popular media where while Surowiecki sees merit in digital collaboration, he comes down on the side of the Yahoo move, arguing that more creativity comes about as a result of FaceTime on the job than it does on the internet. And he talks about Google, which is doing a great deal to allow for ever more digital collaboration, investing heavily. While it's doing that, it's itself investing heavily in face-to-face off environments on corporate campuses and encouraging what he calls old-school collaboration. On the other hand, Jennifer Glass, who's a sociologist, argues against the Yahoo move, saying, quote, workers who collaborate with others in loose networks generate better ideas. So she's coming down on the cyber-utopian side here than those who work in isolated in single locations. So this debate leads to questioning the cyber-utopian view and privileging, exaggerating the uniqueness of collaboration on digital spaces. So I want to, as I said, examine this debate and this issue from the perspective of prosumption, and I'm defining here prosumption as the interrelated process of production and consumption, rejecting the conventional approach where we treat production and consumption as separate phenomena, we treat them as binaries, and arguing that instead we should deal with them as an interrelated process, as a process of prosumption. And it seems to me, when looked at from that perspective, that collaboration is a form of prosumption. It's a dialectical process of two or more parties more or less simultaneously producing and consuming something of mutual interest and importance to them. Interestingly, DIY, do-it-yourself, is also a form of presumption, and this will become important as I move along here, because the idea here is that these two seemingly different phenomena, working collaboratively and working on your own, are both forms of prosumption. So I want to focus especially on the new prosumer, and the reason I emphasize the new prosumer is my basic argument is that we have always been prosumers, that being a prosumer is our primal state. Go back to earliest human history, people were prosumers. They produced what they consumed what they produced. We've always been prosumers. We were prosumers in the Industrial Revolution, even though we were thought of as producers, because producers inevitably must consume various things in the production process. And we were prosumers in kind of the age of consumption after World War II and until recently, or maybe till now, where in the act of consumption we are also producing various things. So my sort of basic argument is that we've always been prosumers, but there's a new prosumer, and the new prosumer has been made possible by the arrival of the new means of presumption. And the new means of presumption is a concept that comes originally from Marx's concept of the means of production. That is, Marx argued that in order to be productive, we needed various structures and phenomena to be productive. So to be productive in the factory, we needed the factory, we needed tools, we need machines, we need those means of production in order to produce. I've written about the means of consumption to argue that in order to consume, similarly, we need various kinds of means of consumption, tools of consumption, checkout counters and scanners and things like that in order to consume. And then a further parallel is to argue that as prosumers, we also need means of presumption. And the new prosumer is one who's embedded in these new means of presumption. And many of those new means of presumption, not all of those new means of presumption, are online. And so I think it's important that we look at this, at the newer versions of this age-old phenomenon of presumption. So I want to differentiate, even though I understand the interrelationship between them, talk about, on the one hand, the material means of presumption, and fast food restaurant will be my paradigm here, and the digital new means of presumption with social network sites, let's say Facebook. And in doing so, and in moving back and forth between these, and in looking at these two things simultaneously, I want to avoid a kind of internet centrism in this analysis, and adopt a broader view, just as I'm adopting, I think, a broader theory to look at the phenomena that exist on the internet, although the phenomena I'm interested in exist beyond as well. So I'm operating with the view that the digital is imbricated in the material world and vice versa, to use Nathan Jurgensen's notion of augmented reality, and P.J. Ray gave me the example of showrooming, shopping on smartphones while one is in department stores as an example of the relationship between the digital and the material world. The conclusion will ultimately be that there's a mixed relationship between the new means of presumption and collaboration. The new means of consumption, both on and offline, encourage both DIY, do-it-yourself, going alone, isolation, and collaboration. But I think there's more collaboration online than offline. So there are unprecedented types and degrees of collaboration possible now because of presumption and the new means of presumption. And as well, much more being done by people largely on their own. The notion, sort of opposing where I started, the notion that there is increased DIY, increased work on one's own, is consistent, for example, with Foucault's work on individualization in prisons and cells and in the panopticon, which dominated the prisons from his point of view. A couple of authors that I deal with a lot argue, for example, the co-creation paradigm, and the co-creation paradigm is another term for prosumption. The prosumer is involved in a co-creation process, or there's a co-creation between producer and consumer, and co-creation is another concept, is a kind of family of concepts that have developed that relate to the notion of prosumption, and co-creation is one of them. But they argue that the co-creation paradigm rests on the notion of increasingly individualized modes of relating, again, pointing to this DIY aspect of prosumption. Indeed, prosumption overlaps with do-it-yourself, and Schultz, in a recent volume on the digital world, describes the online world as a do-it-yourself economy, again, pointing in the opposite direction from where I started. Couple of things on the kind of background on prosumption before we proceed. Much of what I see myself doing over the last couple of years is correcting a historical error. I think the error was traceable primarily to the Industrial Revolution and to a range of theorists like Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and even Veblen, who, because of the Industrial Revolution and the centrality of production in the Industrial Revolution, tended to adopt a productivist bias. They tended to look at the world through a productivist lens. The other interesting thing about that is that Frank Trentman has done studies of studies of the consumer, and found that the whole concept of the consumer is virtually absent from 18th century, 19th century, I think it's 19th century, should read 19th century discourse. So people were not thinking in terms of the consumer. The overall overarching focus was on production. I think after 1950, we see a kind of explosion in the other direction, which I'm labeling consumptionism, where there is this overwhelming focus on consumption as America, for example, moves increasingly from a production-oriented society to a consumption-oriented society. So the American economy now, 70% or so of the American economy now is accounted for by consumption. And that's been reflected in a variety of works by Galbraith and Baudrillard and Bauman. The Journal of Consumer Culture, which was founded about 2000, 2001, is a journal devoted to the study of consumption, and sort of, even though I edited it and I'm kind of denying it, it affirmed the distinction between consumption and production, and focused almost exclusively, if not exclusively, on consumption. And of course, the whole move toward postmodernity, many people who've written about postmodernity have associated postmodernity with consumption. That is, the modern world was a production-oriented society. The postmodern world is the modern world was a production-oriented society. The postmodern world is a consumption-oriented society. So what I want to argue most importantly is we're not producers or workers or consumers. We are not now. We will not be in the future. We have never been producers or consumers. We have always been prosumers. There is no such thing as pure production or pure consumption. They're all varieties of prosumption. So as I said, to me, prosumption is the primal act. It's what we've done from the beginning. It's what we do now, and it's what we're going to be doing in the future. To me, all production involves consumption. So going back to Marx and the idea that the factory worker has to consume all sorts of things in order to produce, has to consume tools and consume machines and consume raw materials. All such acts of production involve consumption of various types, and all consumption involves production. So I mentioned the fast food restaurant and putting customers to work in the fast food restaurant. But beyond that, the importance of people in terms of defining brands and defining brands in certain ways implies a very active role for the consumer. So the consumer is engaged in acts of production as the consumer consumes, just as the producer is engaged in acts of consumption as the producer produces, if that makes any sense. So what I want you to think about is, instead of thinking of a production-consumption continuum or a production-consumption binary, is to think of a continuum where there is no production per se, there is no consumption per se, but there's prosumption as production on one end of the continuum. That is, it's presumption, but it's the kind of presumption that Marx was writing about, right? The factory worker who's consuming as he or she produces. And at the other end of the continuum, there is presumption as consumption. It is the kind of production that you do when you are in a consumption kind of mode. And in the middle of the continuum is something which is a balanced kind of presumption, where there is some middle ground between these two extremes of presumption as production and presumption as consumption. But the important point is, it's all presumption from my point of view, and we need to get away from continuing to commit this historical error of thinking in binary terms. So examples of this phenomenon of presumption in the material world, to at least start with making that distinction. One of the recent examples that was just announced a week or so ago is Walmart is thinking of experimenting with a process whereby it will ask its customers to deliver packages to people who have ordered things online. And so you're taking your consumers and you're asking them to work for you by delivering packages. I thought it was a rather neat example of prosumption. Also, I'm willing to bet quite a bit that it will not come to fruition, because Walmart, I think, will offer a slight discount to consumers who do this. But my guess is that the liabilities there would be so great that Walmart will not be able to carry through on this. You'll have people who potentially can steal the products. More importantly, you have people going into people's homes whose only association with Walmart is they happen to be a customer that day at Walmart, and there are all kinds of risks associated with that. So, beyond that, the rest are all kinds of examples of material presumption that are our day-to-day lives now, increasingly our day-to-day lives. So we work when we go to supermarkets, and of course my favorite example is the self-checkout line at the supermarket, where we are now doing the work that checkout people did. ATM machines, where we are now doing the work, prosuming the work that bank tellers did at one time. DIY yogurt making, where we go into yogurt shops and we mix and match our own yogurt. Electronic check-ins at all sorts of places like airports and hotels, where again we're doing work as consumers that people used to get paid to do. So in the digital world, virtually all of the sites that we're all familiar with, from my point of view, are prosumption sites. Virtually everything that goes on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Wikipedia, blogs, are all examples of presumption. People are producing as they're consuming as they're producing. It's very difficult to distinguish the production and consumption that is going on there. And so I think that's one of the reasons we're talking about the new prosumer and the new means of presumption, because all of these sites are means of presumption from my point of view. MOOCs are an interesting kind of new example of this, a newly arising example of this, where as MOOCs evolve, the consumers, in this case, using that term that I don't like to use, the students will increasingly be asked to do various things that used to be done for them. So it used to be in the old days that professors graded students, but with 138,000 students or whatever on a MOOC, professors are not going to be grading 138,000 essay exams, so they're going to have to develop grading systems whereby the students grade themselves. And there'll be other utilizations of students here to do the work. So the students become both the consumers and the producers of education on MOOCs. So I want to turn now to talk about the four possibilities in terms of DIY and collaboration in the material and in the digital world. Doing things on your own, do it yourself in the material world. I've listed there a whole series of examples of the kinds of things now that we are increasingly doing for ourselves in the material world that are made possible by the new means of prosumption. Fast food restaurants are, from my point of view, one of the new means of prosumption, and they lead us to a variety of do-it-yourself kinds of activities, such as cleaning up after ourselves after we've had a meal, or my favorite example is the fact that as in the drive-through window, we take our own garbage with us, and we have to dispose of our own garbage rather than have somebody dispose of the garbage for us. The new dog washing salons are another example of do-it-yourself in the material world, where because these salons exist, people now bring their dogs there to wash their dogs. IKEA is a kind of classic example of this, and where IKEA has created a system whereby people are doing a variety of things on their own, including, buying, as you know, the components for a bookcase and then going home and putting that bookcase together by themselves. And increasingly in medicine, more and more of us are engaging in do-it-yourself medicine. More and more things are now available in drugstores in terms of monitors of various kinds and tests of various kinds. And so we are doing more and more of these things ourselves that used to be done by physicians and technicians of one kind or another. DIY in the digital world, lots of examples. So on Amazon.com, for example, and sites like it, we do a lot of work there. We're making the choices of purchases, we're providing all the delivery information, we're providing the payment information, we're going through the various steps involved to complete the process. And of course, beyond that, we're writing book reviews for Amazon.com as well. So we're kind of on our own there. We're not collaborating with anybody. We're doing that kind of stuff on by ourselves. Much more importantly is the degree to which we are producing inadvertently all sorts of information, what Walter Benjamin called traces in a different context, for many websites that then use algorithms to trigger ads on the basis of the traces that we're leaving there. But as consumers, we are producing these traces that are then being used to sell us all sorts of things. And buyers and sellers providing information to eBay, doing the ordering, the processing, the sending, the receiving, returning of products, writing on them, voting on eBay guides, and things like that. Again, the consumer is prosuming, the prosumer is prosuming and doing it in a DIY fashion. Now, obviously, there's collaboration. So now we turn to collaboration. There's obviously collaboration in the digital world, and give the examples there. You probably all know these, of Zopa and Airbnb and Couchsurfing, all websites which encourage collaboration of one kind or another. So obviously there is collaboration going on in the digital world, and of course there is collaboration. So sort of finishing the four possibilities here. Of course, there is collaboration in the material world as well. But from my point of view, collaboration in the material world is declining. But we can still, find examples at the counter and the drive-through at the fast food restaurant. So you can still interact with people at the counter at McDonald's, at the drive-through window at McDonald's. I once was giving a talk a number of years ago, and I was criticizing the impersonality of the drive-through windows, and a woman got up in the audience and she was offended by what I said, and she said some of my best friends are the people that work at the drive-through windows at McDonald's. And I paused a moment and I said, that's about the saddest thing I'd ever heard, that your best friends are at the drive-through window. But that went over better in that context. Collaboration at the remaining checkout counters, still staffed by people, where people have not disappeared at the remaining small bookshops. So there is some continuing collaboration in the material world, but as I say, I think it's declining for a variety of reasons. So how do we explain the conclusions on collaboration DIY on material and digital sites? So I've tried to combine all of these things: collaboration, do-it-yourself on material and digital sites. So one of the things I want to argue is that they're explicable in that in both cases, looking at collaboration and isolation as involving the same general process, prosumption. So I'm sort of looking at it from what, from my point of view, is a more abstract process. And as occurring on the same kinds of sites, that is what I'm calling the new means of prosumption. How do we explain the differences, however? And I think here the concept of affordances that we've talked about several times already today are useful in the sense that I think that the differences are due in part to differences in objective affordances. Both the material and the digital worlds and the means of consumption offer objective affordances for collaboration and DIY. But the digital means of presumption, such as Facebook, offer infinitely more affordances for collaboration than the material means of consumption, such as McDonald's. There are simply many more affordances for collaboration on digital sites like Facebook than there are in material sites such as McDonald's. In fact, I think what a place like McDonald's does is to offer whatever the opposite of affordances is, disaffordances or negative affordances, a variety of structures which impede the development of collaboration. So famously, at least initially, McDonald's created chairs in the restaurant which were designed to be uncomfortable after 20 minutes. And so you're discouraged from collaborating because you're sitting there trying to talk to one another and getting more and more uncomfortable. And so there are a variety of the drive-through window, of course, is a negative affordance in the same sense. It totally discourages any kind of collaboration because you don't even enter the restaurant in the first place. I actually often argue that the ideal customer from the point of view of McDonald's and many of the businesses like that is one who never comes into the restaurant. Somebody who comes into the restaurant is a pain in the neck as far as the restaurant is concerned. And McDonald's, as I say, offers more affordances for do-it-yourself, especially clear in the drive-through window. So I've been talking to Nathan and PJ, who you've heard mention and have spoken several times, about this conclusion and trying to explain it further. And we've been relating it to a paper that I wrote with Nathan 3 or 4 years ago on efficiency and effectiveness. And the argument we made in that paper was that something like a structure like McDonald's emphasizes efficiency. What they offer is not very good, but they offer it in a very efficient manner. Whereas, on the other hand, internet-based sites, say Wikipedia, is not very efficient, but it is very effective. We just heard, actually, how effective it is. And what we related it to in that article was abundance versus scarcity. The key issue is abundance versus scarcity. That the abundance of the internet allows you to forego efficiency, in effect, whereas the scarcity of, let's say, a fast food restaurant pushes you in the direction of efficiency. So I think we're in the process of trying to relate all of this to this previous argument on abundance and scarcity and efficiency and effectiveness. One can talk about objective affordances, but one can also, I think, talk about subjective affordances. And it's not just what's objectively offered in these contexts, but people have been socialized and have learned to expect more affordances from digital than material world as far as collaboration is concerned. So users think that Facebook offers nearly infinite possibilities for collaboration, but on the other hand, most of us expect few, if any, such possibilities at McDonald's, especially, for example, at the drive-through window. And this relates to, in sociology, to the famous Thomas theorem. If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So if you define Facebook as a setting which is going to offer you infinite possibilities for collaboration, you're more likely to engage in collaboration, especially if the objective affordances are there. And conversely, if you define McDonald's as a setting which is not going to offer you these possibilities for collaboration, you're much less likely to collaborate, especially if the affordances there are not encouraging collaboration or actively discouraging collaboration. And I think I've made those, the last 2 points there are the same ones that I just made. It seems to me, however, we can talk about objective affordances, we can talk about subjective affordances, but probably what is best is a more dialectical perspective. And I think I heard that this kind of perspective talked about this morning. This sort of stems from another basic sociological notion of the social construction of reality, Berger and Luckman's famous book of that title, where people create social realities, but once those realities exist, they constrain people, and there's an ongoing dialectic between people's construction of reality and the structures that they create. So the structural realities of the material and digital means of prosumption, including their affordances, created historically and created anew each time people are involved with them. However, our ability to create them anew is limited by the residues of past realities and constructions. There are structures there, so we can't engage in a new social construction or a totally new social construction because the residues of structures are already in place. So there are great limitations on the ability to redefine and recreate those settings as well as their affordances. So I think there's an ongoing dialectic between the social construction of affordances and the objective affordances offered by settings in which that social construction takes place. So this is kind of a perspective which integrates the previous two that I was talking about. So the analysis, I think, demonstrates the utility of using a more general set of sociological ideas, prosumption, the new means of prosumption, affordances, rather than ideas largely specific to the internet. I think it allows us to better identify what, if anything, is unique about the digital world, and allows us to debunk the idea that the internet is a totally different utopian space characterized by a dramatic and revolutionary increase in social collaboration. Close with a couple of theoretical ideas on this. From a Marxian perspective, the new means of consumption, McDonald's and Facebook, are largely capitalistic enterprises. Or they are likely to be captured by capitalists once they show signs of success. So the whole issue of MOOCs and people now investing lots of money in MOOCs with the idea that they can control them and earn lots of money from them as capitalistic enterprises. The result is that they are or will be structured in a top-down way to increase control and profits. And this leads to contradicting another mythical idea, in that the digital world is inherently and necessarily decentralized and democratized. It's true in Foucauldian terms that it must be less disciplinary than exercised in other capitalist systems, but that doesn't mean that there is not control in those systems. So digital control is subtler, more about creating ambiances that lead people to do what is desired rather than ordering them to do what is desired, but it is still control nonetheless. In Foucault's terms, it leads to thoughts about the deeper kind of control and the deeper kind of punishment that's associated with these systems, which Foucault talked about in terms of the control and punishment of the soul. So with the increasing ubiquity of the internet, especially social networking sites, one could ask the question, are we immersing ourselves in a hierarchical capitalistic system with unimaginable capacities to punish our souls? But let me close on what I don't like to do, which is a more positive note. I usually like to close on the bleakest possible note I can. But let me close on a positive note, which is when you look at this all from the point of view of critical theory, the Frankfurt School, the new means of presumption, especially the digital means of presumption, are part of what they would call the culture industry. Of course, these did not exist when they were writing about the culture industry, but they clearly would be part of the culture industry if that idea was updated to the contemporary world. So as part of the culture industry, they help to produce mass culture, or a culture, as they say, that is administered, non-spontaneous, reified, phony, rather than the real thing. However, the concept of presumption gives you a kind of positive perspective here. And that is that in comparison to passive consumers, and actually the critical school was really thinking about passive consumers, people who watched movies or listened to the radio and who were simply passively consuming what was given to them. The concept of the prosumer is inherently a more active notion. You have a productive component to it. And so the prosumer is more productive than the consumer, and so there's the potential there of a more agential actor, an actor with greater power, an actor who can change things more than the passive consumer can. So we can better envision, I think, prosumers rebelling against the culture industry, or at least playing a larger role in producing a less phony, more real culture. And this tends to contradict the more pessimistic views of all of my favorite thinkers like Weber and his thinking about the iron cage of rationality, and is more in line with Marx, whose romantic optimism I never could fully subscribe to, and hence I'm much more of a Weberian than I am a Marxian. But in any case, I think determined to end on an upbeat note, that would be the upbeat note that there's at least some positive possibilities there in the concept of the prosumer. Okay, thank you.
You know, the data suggests that the majority of people are not producing, right? That most of the content on a lot of these sites, like Wikipedia, is produced by a very small number of people. Or I'm thinking of like the Chinese worker in a factory producing iPhones, but never really having an opportunity to own one. So when you say we are all consumers, who is that we that you're, is it the same person, or is it some more kind of global entity, or I don't understand.
Well, I think, I guess I'll just talk here. And I think in all cases, even in the cases which look like they are pure production cases or pure consumption cases, it seems to me that there is always both of these processes going on. So the example of the factory worker that I gave, and was Marx's point, that factory worker who seems like he or she is producing is in fact consuming all sorts of things as he or she produces. And the same thing in a pure consumption, what appears to be a pure consumption process. You're frowning at me, so we'll come back.
Consuming food, or what, I mean, what do you mean? What is the factory worker consuming?
Well, Marx argued that the factory worker is consuming tools, raw materials, machines, his own labor time. From Marx's point of view, all kinds of things get consumed in the production process. And if you think about the production process, all sorts of things are being consumed during the production process. So the Chinese workers in what's the name of that big company that produces? Yeah, that produces all the Apple, and they're doing the same thing. They're producing these phones, but they're consuming all the same sorts of things in producing those phones. We're presuming right now, right? I was not, for example, just now observing your face. I'm producing some responses, but I'm also consuming your facial responses. And so we're engaged here in a process of prosumption. So I don't know if that, and the same point about the consumer is never passive. I mean, this actually goes to the Birmingham School and the studies of audiences, and the idea that audiences are always actively constructing the performance. They're not sitting there passively, simply being performed to, but they are active creators of the performance that they're watching. So this idea, co-creation, prosumption, active audiences, I think is all part of this kind of movement to thinking in these terms rather than bifurcating this. Because I think consumers are always producing. You're producing meanings, you're literally producing work when you work in McDonald's. Increasingly, as in fast food restaurants and supermarkets, we're being asked to literally work. But even when we're not asked literally to work, we're doing all kinds of work in the consumption process. The interpretive work, brands only work. They can produce a brand meaning, but we have to produce the desired interpretations for it to work, or we could produce other kinds of interpretations, in which case the meaning won't work. But so I think all of that is presumption. I think it's always a mistake to think that we are either producers or consumers.
Can I just jump in real quick, sort of as the resident Marxist in the room, if I can give a momentary spiel. I think, yeah, I know it wasn't on my badge, I was very disappointed, but,
Dreads do it.
yeah, right, I know, I have to announce it myself, it's good. But there's that sort of adage with, we now have about the web, that silly thing where, if you're not paying, then you're the product, right? That's sort of this folk wisdom now of the web, things that, but it actually originated on like Metafilter, and then somebody appropriated. Anyway, I looked this up one time. But that basic insight, like I think there's actually that actually gets at the heart of what's important about this idea of presumption. Because the truth is every time we think we're consuming something on the web, every time I type something into Google, every time I make, every time I look up anything anywhere, even when I go to Amazon and just buy, a record or something, I'm also simultaneously producing something of value, which of course is data, which of course is sold for ad revenue, and which of course is the entire economy of the internet. So even the very act of consuming is production. It is creating value for those companies, right? It is essentially, us being exploited by those companies, not producing value for them from which they make enormous profits and not getting paid for it, right? And that's happening. That's simultaneous in every act of consumption we do on the web. Therefore, if every act of consumption is a form of production, is producing some value for the company, then every act of consumption is production, and therefore it's presumption, right? And so I think that's, to me anyways, that's what I find really compelling about the concept of prosumption. And I think that's what's so paradigmatically different about being online and all of this sort of data tracking, and that when I was consuming in the store, I mean, I think George would probably agree. You could talk about how there are, people watch my patterns walking through the grocery store, and that might create useful information. But it's a much weaker form of presumption, much more towards the consumption side. But on the internet, it's very clear how everything I do, every single thing I do, is producing value for someone, and therefore it's impossible to imagine an act really that isn't productive in some way when it's digitally mediated like that. And so I think that's why this concept, for me anyways, has sort of been paradigmatically, it's a shift in how I want to think about the economics of the web, or when thinking about digital economies, because I don't really think the act of production and the consumption are ever separable, and it's in part because there's this whole apparatus to constantly surveil us and turn everything we do into production. So.
You've lost George's cheering notes.
Yeah, bringing in that, but it's Marxian, so it's ultimately, yeah.
I mean, I think related to that, because then what interests me in terms of the online space of prosumption
Mhm.
you had to engage in a certain type of presumption. You know, to buy fast food, you are bound by kind of what they've obligated you to do. But in the online space, there seems to be a range of how kind of purposeful you want to be in your presumption. So if you're lurking, you're producing an audience, but you're really not producing much visible beyond that.
Visible to other users,
To
they're
other
still
users.
producing page view
Yeah.
information that's extremely useful to the marketers who are then gonna market stuff to you.
But you could also, within the same space, like something, or vote on something, or kind of shift along that continuum
Absolutely.
much more so. And I think that the argument that everything contains some amount of consumption and production creates this interesting space where you, even if we think we can choose to engage or not engage, we're bound by the system to produce and consume to some level.
Right.
So I think one of
Almost
the
as if
interesting.
we're in an iron cage.
Well, but no, from a critical standpoint, like that idea, and from the social construction standpoint, that idea that we have maybe more flexibility in this environment to shape, you know, the amount of consumption or production. And then that raises the question, you know, are people aware of kind of what these different possibilities are, the consequences of them? In what environments do we expect people to move across the continuum?
People can't be aware because they don't think of themselves as prosumers. We think of ourselves as producers or consumers. We don't think of ourselves as prosumers. But I actually think the example you gave relates back to the abundancy scarcity issue. So the digital world can allow you to actually not buy a hamburger, but you can lurk around for a while because the abundance of it allows that possibility. You can't lurk, or you can't lurk very long at McDonald's before the chair is going to make you uncomfortable, or the car behind is going to honk you, or the policeman's going to throw you out the door. So that scarce world forces certain kinds of things and there's much more freedom. But I think you're reaffirming the point that there's presumption going on. But actually, what it leads to is that we have a kind of blunt instrument here with the concept of presumption. That there's a lot of variability in the process of presumption, and there are a lot of things to think about in terms of similarities and differences between presumption in the material world and presumption in the digital world, and of course in the relationship between them.
Yeah, and I mean, the question then from an organizational or a collaboration standpoint is, do you want everyone all to be on a certain point kind of on that continuum? Or are there benefits to having some people who are, you know, more producers than consumers, and some people are more consumers than producers? Like, what's kind of the best mix? Is there, you know, does that shift depending upon what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, there's no question that the entity is structuring itself, is creating affordances or disaffordances, there's such a term, to create a situation where you've got people more at one end of the continuum than the other end of the continuum. So I think that from the forces that control these kinds of settings, there is an optimum point there. Although but I don't think that there is always one optimum point. I think it's going to differ depending on what it is that the setting is all about.
I like that this paradigm allows us to ask that question.
Yeah.
So I think George is giving us the tools to ask that question without reverting to a false binary. Consumption as consumption, prosumption as production, right, under your spectrum.
Yeah, I forget it all the time, Tyke. I screw it up every time I try to say it. It's very hard to say. I need better terms. But yeah, I mean, those are the welcome kinds of questions. But you can't ask those questions unless you start thinking in terms of presumption. That's the prerequisite, I think. And I think it's a paradigm change. That judging, the irony of Toffler's work was that even though he created the idea, wrote a great deal about it that was very good, there's almost no discussion in the literature of Toffler's notion of presumption. It just disappeared for a couple of decades. And I think actually it's one of those ideas that was before its time, that it was really the digital world And the obvious application of prosumption to the digital world that opened the space for people to start paying much more serious attention to this notion of prosumption.
Other questions? I'm going to bring one from Twitter then. So one from Jen Trady, and there was some discussion by PJ and Nathan on Twitter regarding this, but I wanted to throw it out to you, George. Ritzer claims that there's more collaboration done online than offline. Where's the data for this? And one thing that PJ and Nathan raised is, do you need data for this?
You know, one of the reasons I'm a social theorist is that, you know, I don't do data, I don't need data to assert what I'm asserting. I mean, the point is that I make a series of theoretical arguments. It seems to me that if they have any utility, you know, others will empirically test it and see whether it's a hypothesis, right? I don't have data for I've never had any data for anything that I've ever said, so this would not be unusual, but you know, a few of those ideas have proved useful and people have used them in various kinds of empirical ways, and it's an obvious place to do an empirical test of it. But I don't know that you necessarily have to have the people who are expounding the theoretical idea also do the empirical tests of those ideas. That would be nice, but that doesn't much happen. And I think in the academic world, it tends to be a binary. Maybe we need a new concept to integrate the two.
Any other questions? Great, thank you very much.
Okay.